Where you are holding this session tonight was a very wooded, swampy, alligator and mosquito infested area. It was 1885, and there was nothing in this west part of the west bank of the Hillsborough River. Something had just happened on the east bank of the Hillsborough River. A Spaniard by the name of Vicente Martinez Ybor had convinced his friend and competitor, Ignacio Aya, to move their cigar factories, Martinez Ybor from Key West, Ignacio Aya from New York. Let's move down to that area east of Tampa Town. Notice that I said Tampa Town. It didn't become the city of Tampa until 1887. But as they arrived and bought 40 acres, and then another 40 acres, and then an extra 100 acres east of the Hillsborough River, it would become what you and I frequently call Ybor City. The few businessmen that were in Tampa at the time, and you might say, why does he say few? Tampa had, get ready for this, this was the population, 750 people. Wow. Almost as many as are here tonight. And there were a few professionals that were hoping that some industry would get to this area. Among those that was listening carefully was a man that we all know his name and we know it well, Mr. McFarland. Mr. McFarland was a lawyer. He had recently moved from New Orleans to Tampa. He had moved from Massachusetts before that. He was a foreigner, like so many of our parents and grandparents. He was born in Scotland, but had moved to Tampa and was there when they were talking about an industry making cigars. They didn't care what type of industry it was going to be, so long as it was with people and business and money. Mr. McFarland and some of his associates paid close attention to this dream of creating a city on the east bank, and they started wondering, well, if the Spaniards can do it over there, why can't we do it on the west bank? So by golly, Mr. McFarland bought some land, and Mr. Benjamin, George Benjamin, an important name that I want you to remember, he also bought some land. He convinced his father-in-law, Dr. Collins, to buy some land. And they talked to John Drew to buy some land, and he bought a lot of land. And they needed a banker. So they spoke to Mr. Cluis. He would become famous years later because he was the founder of Cluis Ton down in the Okeechobee area. Mr. Cluis was the first president of the Bank of West Tampa, right on the corner of what became Howard and Main. They bought the land. It was full of trees, mosquitoes all over, alligators all over. They started chopping down trees. They had a lot of lumber. If we could only do what was done in Ybor City, if we could convince cigar makers to leave Key West and move here, we would have another industrial center. In order to convince the cigar makers, they had to make some very nice offers. We'll give you 10 lots. We'll build you the factory as incentive for you to bring your workers here. We'll give you $5,000. Believe me, $5,000 in 1890 and 1891 and 1892, as we say in West Tampa, was mucho money. But it was incentive enough that convinced a cigar factory in Key West to move here. The first factory was Del Pino. And the Del Pino and the brothers came here, and Mr. McFarland opened the first wooden cigar factory exactly where we have the West Tampa Library today. We call it Howard, we now call it Union. And Mr. McFarland said, Mr. Del Pino, we're going to call what later became Howard Avenue, Del Pino Avenue. So they moved here. As the cigar workers got here and the tobacco arrived, they started making some cigars. The problem was that Mr. McFarland, Mr. Benjamin, Mr. Drew, even the banker had never given thought, how do we get people into that area? For your information, I want to put this down. For your information, there was no Fortune Street Bridge. The only way that you could go from the East Bank to the West Bank was to go to Mr. Hooper's ferry. A ferry? Nothing more than a barge, a flat top that would float over the Hillsborough River, and they had a rope. Some say they even had a chain, and this is what would happen. You would get on the barge, Hooper, father or son, would bring you to the West Bank. Some of you that are natives of West Tampa will remember where the river meets the land is what we used to call Robert City. And before calling it Robert City, we called it by the original name, Ellinger City, because of factories, important factories that built their factories in that area. Anyway, you would get off of the barge, and of course, there was no pavement. They had knocked down the trees, and now you had to walk approximately 10 blocks to get to where we now call Howard and Main. 10 blocks of walking, and then walk into the factory, and then work all day, and then walk back, get on Mr. Hooper's barge, and go across. The Del Pino brothers were saying, we can't succeed unless we have people and material, tobacco. And it's a long haul. So Del Pino is getting ready to either go into bankruptcy or leave the new experiment called West Tampa. And the big guys get together and they say, we need to build a bridge. The bridge becomes what we as kids used to call the Fortune Street Bridge. And Mr. McFarland knows that it's going to cost some $30,000, dollars of 1892. And he needs help. He can't finance that by himself. He's already made a major investment in the building of the factory, giving him an incentive of money to come to West Tampa. So he convinces Mr. Benjamin to help him out. Mr. Benjamin had already bought land next to the Hillsborough River. He had gotten his father-in-law, Dr. Collins, to buy some land. So they thought, we better put this money for the bridge or our investment may go down the drain. So they called in a few others. They all chipped in, and the Fortune Street Bridge, now called the Fortune Taylor Bridge, was completed in 1893. That was the year that the Del Pino brothers said goodbye to West Tampa because they were almost into bankruptcy. I want you to pay attention to this design right here. This was the original intent that Mr. McFarland had for what was going to be Pino City. And knowing that in English tradition there is a town square, he put in the middle of his lots a town square. The names, of course, were for Del Pino, but the Del Pino Avenue would become Howard. But after a while, Mr. McFarland changed his mind. Forget the town square on the corner of what is now Howard and Main Street. So there is no town square. But Del Pino leaves, and another big factory decides to move here by the name of Fernandez O'Halloran, in Spanish, O'Ayoran. The Fernandez O'Halloran comes to Tampa as the Del Pino is leaving, and Mr. McFarland changes the names of the streets. We still have Isolina in West Tampa, which is a one-block street, because there was going to be a square. The one street that still survives is Isolina, right behind Salcines Park. And Mr. McFarland says, instead of calling the main drag, well, the main drag was going to be Main Street. That never changed. But the Del Pino, I'm going to call it Howard. Why did he select Howard? Because Howard was his son. So Howard Avenue is Howard McFarland. He became a famous lawyer downtown with the McFarland Ferguson firm that his father had founded. What we now call Albany, Mr. McFarland said, I'm going to call that street Francis. Why Francis? Mrs. McFarland was Frances McFarland. That was all well and good until 1925, when the city of West Tampa ceased to be an independent city, and the city of Tampa had embraced the city of West Tampa. They already had a Francis, so they changed the name of the Francis in West Tampa and call it Albany. There was an oak, but Tampa already had an oak, so they changed the name and we now call it Union. So the corner of Howard and Union is where our famous library is located. That library is the oldest library in all of Hillsborough County. It was financed by none other than another one from Scotland who answered Mr. McFarland's letter, "Hey, you're giving money away for libraries, send me some." And Mr. Carnegie, Andrew Carnegie, sent the money, and we now have and have had for more than 100 years the West Tampa Library. In any case, the streets in West Tampa, the land that Mr. McFarland had bought, he named for his son, he named it for his wife, and he said, "I want to name the streets in this area for trees." That's why we have cypress, spruce, walnut, cherry, beech. It's B-E-E-C-H. But the city likes to put an A and make you think that we have a beach in West Tampa. So all the streets in Mr. McFarland's West Tampa are named for trees. I was having a nice conversation just before we got started, and I was asked, "DJ, why do we have Saint this and Saint that? St. Conrad, St. Joseph, St. Louis." The Jesuits bought some land and they named those streets for saints. Supposedly, the Jesuits had no money, but Mr. Cluis, the banker, said, "Don't worry, I'll finance it." So we have a group of saints just before you get to Columbus Drive, which used to be called Michigan. In West Tampa, never pronounced correctly. The Cubans would call it La Michigan. In any case, Mr. Benjamin and his father-in-law are the ones that developed the area that we called Ellinger City and later Robert City, and now we have Blake High School in that area. They chose to call those streets by numbers: 10th Avenue, 9th Avenue, 7th Avenue, and so forth. Another interesting part of that is Mr. Drew. Mr. Drew bought a lot of land. In fact, at one time, the original airport that we had was Drew Field, named for Mr. Drew. Mr. Drew bought a lot of land just north of Columbus Drive. And listen to his children's names: Eileen, Cordelia, Leroy, okay, and Ivy. And supposedly his son was Wesley, and I don't know, but I still live on Braddock Street, and it used to be Wesley. Of course, those were the children of Mr. Drew. Drew is a very, very important name for you to remember, because he bought so much land that we now have HCC in the Drew Park area, the airport, which when I was a kid and we used to fly to Havana on national airlines, we used to get the plane at the end of Tampa Bay Boulevard and West Shore. Eventually, they knocked down that terminal and built the terminal on Columbus Drive, La Michigan. Eventually, they knocked that one down and they built one of the most modern airports in the world that we should be very proud, thanks to Mr. Drew, one of the original partners in developing this West Tampa area. Now, as West Tampa starts to develop, they're bringing in more factories. A lot of factories from Key West moved here. Factories from Atlanta moved here. Factories from Chicago moved here. Factories from Philadelphia and New York moved here. Tampa was not only becoming the cigar capital of the United States, it was also filling those cigar boxes with a stamp at the back that said, "Made in Tampa." So those cigar boxes went all over the US, and people would say, "Tampa, where is Tampa?" So Tampa became more and more famous all over because way before cigarettes started to become popular, the stogie was very important. I lectured for many years up in Chicago at the law school at Northwestern, and if there is one big city that is a cigar smoking city, is Chicago. Wherever you go, men walk around with their cigars, and Tampa ads, Tampa Nuggets, have a Tampa, Cuesta en Rey, are still seen in a lot of parts of Chicago and Cook County. So with the cigar industry came tobacco or cigar box production. So in bringing the cigar manufacturers, they made the cigars from the tobacco that they imported from Cuba. Quality tobacco. They had to put it in a box, and then they wanted to market these products. So the local German friend said, "We can put a label." "You can?" "Yes, we can put a nice looking lady smiling, and we could put green and red and yellow. Let's see it." So the cigar label is born. Not only did the cigar labels get put on the boxes, then they said, "Why don't you put a band around each cigar? Let's see what it looks like." Again, green, yellow, whatever colors. And if you were buying a cigar and you walked up to a cigar stand and there is a plain box with cigars laying there, and next to it is a cigar with a beautiful label, a colorful, smiling lady, you're going to be attracted to that lady smiling at you. And you look at the box and you see that the cigars have a band. I guarantee you that the marketing technique works. Give me 3 of those. "No, I won't take this one. Let me have 4. So the labels really became a selling mechanism. So with the cigar industry came the importation of tobacco, the creation of the cigar box, and we certainly had a lot of lumber, and the creation of the label and the band. So wherever you go now, you see cigar boxes with very nice labels. They're produced much more cheaply now than years ago, when it took a lot of stone and coloring and one thing and another. But in any case, the Tampa boxes are all over the world. You'll go to China, you'll go to Germany, you'll go to Sweden, and you'll be negotiating the purchase of this or that, and not uncommonly, the man goes to the back, he gets his cigar box, he comes over, he opens mostly a Tampa cigar box and changes your money. Or he keeps stamps, or he keeps other things in his valuable cigar box. More than likely, it's a Tampa-made cigar. In any case, people start arriving. They need restaurants. They need boarding houses, because a lot of men came by themselves, so they needed a room. They needed a place where they could eat. If the cigar factory was here, the same guy that built the factory would build a rooming house. When we were growing up, next to every cigar factory, there was some rooming house. They lived on the second floor, and they used to take their food in the first floor because there was a restaurant. So when they got up, they would come down for their café con leche. They would cross the street to go work in the factory, and then they would walk out and go to La Fonda to eat in La Fonda, and then come back to work until 3, 4, 5 o'clock, and then probably stop at a bar, have a shot of booze, go home, and take a bath. Those of us that are born and raised in West Tampa and Ybor City, where the cigar factories were prominent. By the way, we had almost 300 cigar factories between Ybor City, West Tampa, Palmetto Beach. Those cigar factories, of course, produced cigars from tobacco. That odor would get into the fibers of the clothes. And especially the women with all their hair, they would come home, como huele eso a tabaco. So, by 5 o'clock, every man and every woman in West Tampa had taken a bath. We may not have had a shower, but we had those big tubs with the 4 lion legs holding it up, because you wanted to flush out, you wanted to clean, you wanted to bathe, and by 6 o'clock, when the meal was being completed, everybody was nice and fresh, because you'd gotten rid of the odor of the tobacco. With people came need for schools. Initially in West Tampa, what we had was private education. In other words, I would leave my child here in the corner because Miss So-and-so would not only take care of the child during the work hours, but would give my child some type of instruction. The instruction was primarily in Spanish. So we used to have a lot of neighborhood daycares, let's call them, schools. Eventually, the county said, you know, we really need some type of a school system. So in the cities, they would then try to raise money, and they developed their own city school boards. We had one outstanding cigar manufacturer here by the name of Angel Cuesta. Angel Cuesta was very sensitive to the need of education. So he hired a teacher, and his employees would leave their kids in the Cuesta school while the parents went to the Cuesta cigar factory on the corner of Howard and Beach, and the kids were getting an education, and at the same time they were being taken care of. With time, the school system built the school right here in West Tampa on Tampania and Cherry. And Mr. Cuesta said, I'll help out with the costs of building the school. He didn't have to take care of his own private school anymore. He now had a place where his employees could send their children. And they named that school A.L. Cuesta, Ángel La Madrid Cuesta. In Spain, he was Ángel Cuesta La Madrid. La Madrid was his mother's surname. But in the United States, when he was living in Atlanta, his friend said, in the United States, we put our mother's surname as a middle initial. So instead of being Ángel Cuesta La Madrid, he put the L as a middle initial. So he became A.L. Cuesta. So with time we had McFarland School. Then we had McFarland Park right across the street from where we are today. And since we're talking about McFarland Park, how did this McFarland Park get created? Mr. McFarland gave to the city of Tampa all of this land, and if we got into a plane and we were flying or hovering in a helicopter looking down to the land that Mr. McFarland gave, this would be like the Red Cross. Think of what the Red Cross is like, and that is the land that Mr. McFarland gave here. So this is really a Red Cross in design. And in the deed that he gave to the city of West Tampa when he gave this land in 1909, he put a clause that said it is to be used for recreational purposes. And like so many clauses and deeds, people don't read them or they don't think about them. 100 years went by, and somebody says, hey, they've just put the interstate system next to McFarland Park. Why don't we sell some of that land adjacent to the expressway, and we'll make some money for the city? It came out in the Tampa Tribune. The grandchildren of Mr. McFarland read the article, and they dictated a letter. Dear Mayor Friedman, we read in the paper that you're thinking about developing the land at McFarland Park. Please have your lawyers read the deed, because when our grandfather or great-grandfather gave that land to the city of West Tampa, he put a clause. If it ever is not used for recreational purposes, it reverts back to the McFarland family. So very quickly, they changed the song, and McFarland Park stays as Mr. McFarland gave it to him. We have had others that have really made significant contributions. I told you, Mr. Drew, when I was a little boy, Dale Mabry did not exist. When I would get to Lincoln, I was pretty much at the extent of what we called West Tampa then. If we went up to Tampa Bay, a little further north, I don't remember Buffalo, but all of those were dairies. A lot of dairies, the Faedo Dairy, the Castrillon Dairy, and so forth. Those dairies eventually disappeared, and West Tampa went expanding. Industries came, schools came, and then we were attacked in Pearl Harbor, and we had already bought some land at the end of the peninsula that we now call MacDill Field. Right. Mr. Drew had rented some of his acreage to a small airport when the planes had two wings, biplanes, and then the U.S. government leased this land, and they already had MacDill, and they knew that they were going to be making planes and needing tanks and needing heavy motors. So they said, we need to build a heavy highway. So between MacDill, what we now call Air Force Base, and Drew Field, a very important road called Dale Mabry. It is probably one of the best constructed highways in all of Florida, because we were going to be transporting heavy motors, tanks, whatever military equipment. So we used to think that new street out there called Dale Mabry is probably the extent of West Tampa. And then as it started moving, Buffalo is selected by the nuns to build the hospital. And we got St. Joseph Hospital. So now we used to think the northern limit of West Tampa has to be Buffalo Avenue, now called Martin Luther King. And then more developments started, and then we used to think, well, maybe West Tampa goes all the way to Hillsborough Avenue. So in time, these developments were going like this, and there was an important building that had originally been Mr. Benjamin's property. Mr. Benjamin had a lot of land, and he went to see Mr. Plant, and he told Henry B. Plant, look, why don't you take my property and build your hotel there? Mr. Plant decided he was not going to build his hotel in Mr. Benjamin's land. He was going to build his hotel next to the river. And of course, we now call it the University of Tampa. But what happened to Mr. Benjamin's gift? Well, that became Benjamin Park and Benjamin Field, because those biplanes would come in, and in 1913 and 1914, our people were all fascinated by this thing called airplanes. It was a brand new phenomenon. So Benjamin Field would have weekend visits of these small planes, and Drew Field would have planes and people would go there. And in time, that became a military base, and MacDill became a military base, and Benjamin Field became Fort Homer Hesterly. And that's where our state militia, also known as the National Guard, had their headquarters. And that's where many of us would go to see the Latin Fiesta. And we would go there 2 separate Saturdays in February, one to vote for who's going to be the queen, and the next Saturday was the coronation. And Leon Kazin, who had opened up one of the movie houses in West Tampa called the West Town, and before that it was the Kazin Theater, was pretty much the brains behind the Latin Fiesta. With time, not only did Elvis Presley come to Fort Homer Hesterly, 4 days before he was killed, John F. Kennedy gave a speech at Benjamin Field, also known as Fort Homer Hesterly. I see that my time is almost up, but I want to share with you, I've brought some memorabilia that I think you would enjoy looking at. This one particularly, don't leave without studying this one. Here you have how little by little, this was Fort Brooke before there was a Tampa town. And then there was a Tampa town. And then we started electing mayors in Tampa town and city councilmen. With time, Hyde Park and Tampa Heights started to develop. And in orange is the area known as West Tampa. Okay? So you see how it started growing and going north, going south, going east, going west, and West Tampa in 1925 ceases to be an independent city. It had been created in 1895, and here, 30 years later, in 1925, West Tampa is part of the city of Tampa. As you see, more growth, but in 1953, very important, look at huge annexation. This all used to be Hillsborough County. In 1953, that county land became part of the city of Tampa thanks to a young representative by the name of Sam Gibbons. He had a lot of friends in West Tampa, certainly got elected in West Tampa overwhelmingly, then became a congressman after being a state senator. But in 1953, a law that was proposed by State Representative Sam Gibbons acquired, look, almost down to Ballast Point, Bayshore, Palmacia, Interbay, all the way up to Fowler Avenue, all the way across next to the University of South Florida, and then coming down here to Palm River. All of that in 1953 became part of the city of Tampa. And here, in this little corner, 1961, the city of Port Tampa. Some call it the Ellis Island of Florida because so many immigrants came in through our Port Tampa or Ellis Island, And that became part of what we now call the city of Tampa. Before you leave, study these annexations, but also leave with this thought. At one point, Hillsborough County went all the way to Clearwater, all the way to Tarpon Springs, all the way to St. Petersburg, and that was referred to as West Hillsborough. It was all part of a very huge Hillsborough County. But then in 1912, Pinellas County was created. So then Hillsborough lost the western peninsula, and this is the Hillsborough County of today. I hope you've enjoyed the program. I'm going to be around for any questions. Thank you.